afternoon, and welcome Mrs. Ban, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and on behalf of the Women's International Forum, I should like to welcome back here today Sir Brian Urquhart, former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations for Special Political Affairs, who has so graciously agreed to speak to us all today. If you permit me, we should also like to thank the press corps of the Secretary General's office for all their assistance, as we're privileged to be able to use the Dag Hammarskjöld Library Auditorium today. I'd just like to remind you all to please turn off cell phones, and our President, Amy Hamidon, will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sue. Well, Sir Brian, he's a man with the UNID 0002. Yeah. And so that tells a lot about Sir Brian. Actually, I did check his telephone number in New York, and it's 1212 something 963. You know, so I think he's so linked to the UN that we can't separate him from the UN. Women's International Forum is so elated and privileged to have this golden opportunity to have Sir Brian address us. And this is also a momentous occasion because we are hosting Sir Brian in this very Dag Hammarskjöld Library Auditorium. He is the one deeply involved in the conception of this library and the auditorium itself. So this is a memorable occasion for us. Sir Brian has had an extraordinary life. Much of it has revolved around the UN system. His professional life is a history of the UN itself. He was here in 1945 and soon became the personal assistant of the first UN Secretary General. From 1953 to 1971, Sir Brian worked with Ralph Bunche, which ultimately led to the first UN peacekeeping force in the Suez Canal in 1956. In 1972, he succeeded Ralph Bunche as USG for Special Political Affairs. He stayed on this role until 1986, 14 years. Sir Brian was born in England and studied at Oxford and served in the British Army in England, North Africa, and Europe, and then he came to America in 1945, 46. He remembers more than I. He's a successful author. His books on Dag Hammarskjöld, Ralph Bunche, I think should be found in the UN bookshop, but I think you probably get it on Amazon.com now. I'm sorry, I'm advertising for Amazon, but that's what it is. Yeah, today, Sir Brian is a tireless speaker and an activist. So I present Sir Brian Urquhart and his legendary role in the UN, then and now. Sir Brian.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, Sue. Mrs. Ban, it's wonderful to have you here. I've always wanted to talk to this group, actually, but I never got asked. So this is the fulfillment of a long-held dream. I said that I would talk about the United Nations then and now, and I only realized after I'd said that this is a silly title because you can go on for about 4 days and never get to the end of it. So we'll see what happens. What I would like to do is to talk for about 20 or at the most 25 minutes, but at my age that's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, it's more like 3 hours, so that if anybody feels that I'm going over time, blow a bugle or wave a flag or set fire to the building or something, so that we have a question and answer period, because that to me is much more interesting than what I will drone on about, and I think that it's more fun to discuss things actually than to have to listen to someone talking. I'm increasingly perplexed as to what I actually represent now. About half the time I seem to be like Hamlet's father's ghost, sort of roving the battlements at night and saying dire things about what things have come to and how awful it is in Denmark and that kind of thing. But I don't really like that. I suppose that in a sense when you become an old observer of an organization you spent most of your life in, it's more like being a one-man Greek chorus or something like that. But anyhow, what I thought I would try to do is to go rather briefly through the different kind of impersonations or identities of the UN and end up where we are now with one or two thoughts about that. Like most great ideas, the UN was more or less out of date before it started. It was set up to deal with the situation in the 1930s, which led to World War II, which was aggression by military powers and an extremely serious world economic depression, which created the context for revolutionary efforts in various countries, leading to things like Nazism in Germany and so on. And it was therefore set up to deal with aggression and economic depression. And of course, that wasn't at all what everything was about in 1945. And ever since 1945, when the Charter was signed, and early in 1946, when the UN set up shop in New York, in the various curious locations, a bomb site factory on Long Island, a college in the Bronx, and various other exotic locales, made it very difficult to function at all. And eventually this building was built. Now it seems to have been unbuilt, but I'm glad we're in the one room in the place which has survived. Really, the original idea of the UN happened long before 1945, when the Charter was signed. The UN really was founded on the 1st of January in 1942, when President Roosevelt had been meeting with Winston Churchill in an extremely dangerous part of the war. The United States had just come into the war and had suffered enormous losses already in the Pacific, and the British had been hanging on by their fingernails for the previous 2 years. And it looked as if Hitler and the Japanese military government were absolutely unstoppable. And in this, Roosevelt and Churchill made a declaration about, which was based on Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, about what they thought the war was for. And on the 1st of January, they called on 26 governments who were by that time engaged in fighting the war to join in something that was called the Declaration of what? And the night before this declaration was to be published to the world, they still didn't have a title for the kind of group. They had all sorts of things like Allies in Pursuit of Freedom and whatever it was. That kind of very long, very unmemorable, very uncatchy. And they were in despair as to have a title. And Roosevelt, in the middle of the night, thought of United Nations, which was snappy and was a call to arms, basically. So as soon as it was reasonably light in the morning, he was wheeled along to Churchill's bedroom in the White House. They went in there with no sign of Churchill, and then they heard a lot of sluicing and splashing going on. And so President Roosevelt shouted, "Winston!" And to everybody's amazement, this cherubic, totally naked, dripping figure suddenly appeared in the room. And Roosevelt said, "United Nations." And Churchill said, "Excellent," and went back into the bathroom. This is how history is made. Now, I'm not making this up. What is amazing about this, it comes from the discovered diaries of Churchill's then devoted secretary, who had recorded this amazing spectacle, having witnessed it. Anyhow, that's the United Nations for you. But much more important than that is the United Nations was a military organization. And it's surprising, if you look at the publications of that time, how often that word is used instead of saying the Allies or something. I mean, for example, both Germany and Japan surrendered to the United Nations. They did not surrender to the alliance or whatever it was. And every country, including the Soviet Union, made a great deal of this title, and there were great displays of flags. The United States even invented a UN flag which nobody else had actually sanctioned, but which was put out of business when the current flag was produced in San Francisco. But anyhow, I think if you want to understand what the UN was and why it has been as it has been, it's important to realize that it was a military organization. It was the name in which the Allies fought for nearly 4 years a fairly gruesome world war. And of course the Charter reflected that, because the thing that impressed people in the Charter was that defeating aggression was the main reason for the UN, and the Security Council was a much more powerful organization than anything the League of Nations had had. And the Security Council theoretically would be able to declare a nation an aggressor and take action against it, military action on a serious, large military scale. I mean, the permanent members of the United Nations, and especially the United States and the Soviet Union, were supposed to produce very large air forces, very large naval forces, and land forces of up to 10, 12, 15 divisions. This is a lot of soldiers. It's not peacekeeping. This was the main surprise which was unfolded in San Francisco when the Charter was finally approved. And it had the leaders of the wartime alliance taking charge and being responsible not only for monitoring the peace in the Security Council, but also enforcing it if necessary. And people like me, who were young and full of enthusiasm for the UN, thought this was wonderful. Well, it was fine, except, of course, it was politically impossible. There was no such thing as unanimity in the Security Council in 1945. And in another year, we were in the Cold War, an ideological struggle, which was also, it was in danger of becoming a military struggle. So that was the first phase. And this was I wrote down here the phase 1, Euphoria, because there was the smiles and general bonhomie at a conference like San Francisco actually concealed what were already big power struggles, especially between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union was virtually destroyed by the war. It had lost 25 or 26 million people. It did not have a nuclear weapon, which the United States did, and was dependent for reconstruction on outside help. And they were extremely sensitive about this position and were not going to let the United Nations become just a kind of plaything of the United States and the West. So that there were a lot of tensions already. By the time we had the Preparatory Commission in London in 1945, this was 2 months after the war was over 3 months after the war was over in Europe, and 1 month after the war had finished with the nuclear explosion with Japan. There was still a lot of bonhomie, and Mr. Gromyko made jokes of a somewhat kind of ponderous nature. Adlai Stevenson dispensed a great deal of wisdom and charm. Jan Masaryk, who was the member from, a tragic figure later, was the member from Czechoslovakia, and was very good at fairly scaly jokes of one sort and another, sometimes causing embarrassment, and so on. It was an extremely distinguished group, the Preparatory Commission, and it got through its work quite quickly. One of the things it decided was that the United Nations should be in the United States. which was against the wishes of most of the European countries, and not particularly popular with the United States either, but that was what happened. And this was the organization that was going to be built on the basis of the UN Charter. By the time we got to New York in March 1946, the smiles were getting pretty forced, I must say. And the first items on the agenda of the Security Council were the Soviet troops in Iran, followed quickly by the British and American troops in Indonesia, followed by Allied troops in Greece. These were vitriolic debates between the East and the West. Mr. Gromyko made history by walking out of the Security Council, which was then in the gymnasium of Hunter College in the Bronx, which is now Lehman College. And the UN was number one news. It was, at that point, reasonably popular in the United States, because Roosevelt, in order to get the Congress not to vote against the Charter, which is what had happened with the League of Nations, had sent Adlai Stevenson and Louis MacNeice, who was then in the OSS but was also a poet, on a year's journey around the United States, explaining to people that this was something enormously in the interest of the United States. I think they were much too successful. It was estimated that 94% of the population was in favor of the United Nations by the time they were finished. And of course, inevitably, the UN was a great disappointment. It wasn't this wonderful alliance that won the war. It was an ideological Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. That really got going in the late 40s. There was a period of great disillusionment, ending up with a rather curious historical fluke, which was the invasion of South Korea by North Korea in 1950, and the action by the Security Council to immediately take enforcement action against North Korea. This was possible because the Soviet Union at that time was boycotting all meetings of the United Nations, and they didn't get there in time to veto it. This had a rather interesting sort of personal result, actually, because Stalin was so furious about this that he issued an order that the Soviet ambassador was never to leave the Security Council chamber, ever, under any circumstances whatsoever. Yes, exactly. As long as the Council was in session. And this was pretty awful, actually, because, I mean, this thing was going on for 4 or 5 hours at a time with these endless speeches, which were very, very popular in those days. This was a pretty serious affair. We got around it, but this was really a breaking point in the history of the UN. The United States was the organizing country. A huge military operation was put in under very difficult circumstances, and eventually did become triumphant after many mistakes and really terrible military disasters. The Secretary General, Trygve Lie of Norway, the first Secretary General, quite rightly had backed this operation and had done everything he could to help it. And for that he was excommunicated by the Soviet Union, so that it really was very, very difficult with one whole group of countries, the Soviet group in the UN, to function. They wouldn't speak to the Secretary General. And altogether this was an extraordinarily gloomy time. And Lee resigned, saying that he couldn't go on functioning without the support of all the permanent members of the Security Council. And after an endless series of unsuccessful efforts, the Security Council, on the recommendation of the French and British governments, appointed a then totally unknown Swede, Dag Hammarskjöld. I think that the great powers in the Security Council had the delightful impression that Hammarskjöld was a very neutral, very, very cautious Swedish civil servant. If so, they made the most delightful mistake, because Hammarskjöld was an enormously strong character. He was an absolutely brilliant man, and passionately believed in making the UN work, even if it meant annoying the United States or the Soviet Union or anybody else come to that. And so after this very depressing start, Hammarskjöld came here, I think I'm right in saying, in 1953. And we began what I call the phase of improvisation. Hammarskjöld realized the United Nations was not going to work as it said in the Charter. It couldn't during the Cold War, there wasn't any question. So he set about finding useful things for it to do, and one of them was to have a mechanism for preventing regional conflicts in the Middle East or Africa or wherever it was, which might conceivably set off an East-West nuclear confrontation, since they were mostly in rather strategic places. And this really came into being after the British-French expedition to attack Egypt in 1956, the Suez Crisis it was called. The only way to get the British and French out of Egypt in a reasonably respectable way was to put in a UN military force to take their place. And that was done. And that was the beginning of peacekeeping, which was the great improvisory creation of the United Nations. I suppose up until now, it's something that's not in the Charter. It's completely new. And it is very, very much, has been very, very useful. I understand there are now something like 130,000 UN troops in various parts of the world, though you don't hear very much about them. And that is a very important and useful function. All of this time, there had been a great world movement in the background, and I won't go into the background of it, we'll be here all night, but to decolonize the European empires. That is, to give independence to what up to then had been dependent territories in the French, the British empires around the world. It's some very large part of the Earth's surface. And that really started to gain momentum with the independence of India, the total independence of India in 1947. I was told, I remember, by what was called a Foreign Office, what the devil were they called? I can't remember a Chinese name. My memory for names isn't. So I was told, don't worry your head about decolonization, it'll take 150 years. I immediately assumed that it would actually be rather short, and sure enough it was. The decolonization process was virtually over in 20 years. The UN was very much the catalyst for that, because it was possible to give independence to former colonial territories in a positive and more or less respectable way for the imperial powers, and they did it. And this, of course, revolutionized this organization altogether, and it went from its original 50 members to the 192 it now has, a proportion of that increase being newly independent countries. So we come to phase 4, which is, I mentioned Dag Hammarskjöld. I should say again that he was a very extraordinary person, contrary to the original assessment. And he really did, in a way, put the United Nations on the map in a way it hadn't been put on the map before, as an active organization which, in very, very difficult, dangerous situations, could do something practical on the ground, something that it had failed to do before. He was killed, as you know, in an air crash in Central Africa, in what is now Zimbabwe, on his way to meet the secessionist president of the Katanga province of the Congo to negotiate him back into the Congolese central government, and I think he would have succeeded. And this was a huge loss. He was succeeded, and it was his idea, I think, by U Thant of Burma, who was a very different character from Hammarskjöld, but I think also very remarkable. He gave the impression of a very quiet man. He was a very devout Buddhist. but he was a very courageous person and was prepared to take risks in a way that Hammarskjöld even would have been rather cautious about. One of the things he did was to fling himself in an effort to try to end the Vietnam War. He had no authority to do this, but he tried. And I think if the plan he had actually put privately to everybody involved had been accepted in Washington, it might have been resolved something like 5 years earlier than it was, because it was actually very much like the plan that Henry Kissinger negotiated 5 years later. 5 years and about 150,000 casualties later. He was a very quiet person. He took the UN over when it was in a state of complete disarray because the Soviet Union and President Charles de Gaulle of France had both taken extreme dislike to Hammarskjöld's rather dominating activities. I mean, if he didn't get any instructions, Hammarskjöld tended to go ahead and do something. And both these supernationalists really hated that. And in particular, Khrushchev, in the most insulting terms in this building, had demanded his resignation. This was a mistake, as it turned out, because then Hammarskjöld replied, and there was the longest and loudest ovation ever given to any speaker in this building at Hammarskjöld's reply, leaving Khrushchev grinning in a most curious manner and beating his slipper on the table. An ominous incident. Nobody's ever explained the slipper, because somebody is said to have taken a photograph from the side showing Khrushchev with both shoes on. So the question arises, did he borrow the slipper from Gromyko, or did he have a slipper in his briefcase for sort of banging purposes? Nobody's ever got this. There are two great mysteries. One is what was in the holster of Yasser Arafat's pistol holster. And the answer is no pistol. But nobody's ever been able to prove that. And nobody's ever been able to figure out quite what on earth this kind of plastic slipper was doing. Never mind. As I was saying, Urquhart took over in a period of complete disarray. The organization was split down the middle on Cold War terms. It was also beginning to split a bit on developing countries against industrial countries. Something and this really made life very difficult. And we had a lot of problems, but there was one problem which actually, I think, in the most unjust possible way, Urquhart got tagged with. Hammarskjöld had negotiated the entry of the peacekeeping forces into Egypt in 1956 with NASA. NASA had just been invaded by two of the permanent members of the Security Council, and Egypt had been invaded a great number of times over 3,000 years by all sorts of foreigners. And the idea of having a force of 9 different nationalities coming in was a bit much for the Egyptians, but they negotiated with Hammarskjöld, and one of the conditions was that once the force had done its main job, the Egyptians had the right to ask for its withdrawal. In the first peacekeeping force, which nobody thought would work, turned out to be an enormous success. In fact, it was rather too successful. And people had begun to think it was like NATO, actually, because nobody would pay for it. We managed to reduce it in the end to 1,200 soldiers on a 398-mile front. This, I don't know how keen you are on military affairs, this is a very thin line. And, but in 1967, NASA was being kind of jeered at by a number of the... Egypt was the leader of the Arab world in those days, and a lot of Arab governments were saying, well, NASA's just hiding behind those blue helmets, and this upset him. So he decided to move back into Sinai, which he had a perfect right to do. It had been Egyptian for about 4,000 years, so there was no question whose territory it was. The Israelis had never allowed the first peacekeeping force on Israeli soil on the grounds of Israeli sovereignty, and nobody really challenged them on that, so that it was a little bit awkward when Egypt retook or tried to retake a part of its own territory to object to it. There was, NASA ordered the peacekeeping force out. Nothing would persuade him that this was going to lead to very serious consequences for Egypt. The Israelis, who had never liked the idea of the Egyptian army right next to them in Sinai, took this, I don't blame them, as a pretext for going into Sinai, and so we had yet another war in the Middle East. Ufant was blamed for withdrawing the force, though he had no other option, no legal option. And in fact, it wasn't any good thinking that 1,200 lightly armed troops with arms not to shoot, with orders not to shoot except in self-defense, could really take on something like 90,000 Egyptians with the latest weapons and an air force ready to go, even supposing it had been legal to do so. Everybody was made to look stupid by this, including NASA. And people settled on Ufant as the scapegoat. And that is what people even now seem to remember about Ufant. I think this is a very great injustice. He was the only person who went to Egypt and tried to persuade NASA that this was an amazingly stupid thing to do. And he didn't get any support, and he didn't succeed. I shall have to hurry up here. Ufant was succeeded by Kurt Waldheim, and a period which I call really the Third World decade. It was when all of these new countries were coming in as members, and some of them had quite radical ideas, not surprisingly, having been colonial territories. And this was a point at which the United States became very much alienated from the UN, and efforts in the General Assembly, like the Zionism is Racism resolution, for example, really created a completely new attitude to the United Nations, which the United States had been the leader in creating. It was a very difficult period. It was marked by a number of wars. In 1973, the crossing of the Suez Canal by the Egyptian army, and an amazing battle in Sinai, and a whole new arrangement there. And then in 1974, the Turks invaded Cyprus after Archbishop Makarios was supposed to have been assassinated. Actually, it was an interesting event, that, because everybody wrote obituaries of Makarios in the main papers, in the New York Times and the London Times and everywhere else. And then Makarios turned up here, and we met him at the airport, and the first thing he said was, "How did you like the obituaries?" Well, very few people have the opportunity to read their obituaries. He did. These were all things in which the UN was intensely concerned, but again, on this shoestring, because we weren't allowed to use force, and we had very small resources. And then we came to the amazing decade of the 1980s, when the Cold War unexpectedly, suddenly came to an end, and the Soviet Union changed into Russia. We had another sort of Secretary General then, and I emphasize the Secretary General because he or she, I hope she at some point, will do have, if they can do it, an enormous influence in trying to push things in the right direction. And that was Perez de Cuellar of Peru, who had actually worked in the UN as an undersecretary. He'd been our representative in Cyprus at one point. He's a very, very quiet man, no desire whatsoever, in fact an acute lack of desire to become a public figure or to celebrity or anything like that. Somebody who was quiet, very skillful, was greatly respected, and I think genuinely had the authority of a quiet, serious person. And it shows you can do it like that too. I think he was very important in the 80s, particularly when we came to the end of the Cold War. And also, of course, there were various disasters. There was the Soviet invasion of Iran, of Afghanistan. There was the Iran-Iraq War, 10 years of pure hell, one of the worst wars ever. And then the events leading up to the end of the Cold War. And I think that his steady hand on the wheel was extremely important. After the Cold War ended, people did not refrain from breaking out the champagne and throwing their hats in the air, and it was widely perceived that the UN would function as it had been supposed to function in 1945. What people didn't think was that the world had radically changed since then, and that it wasn't going to happen, and it didn't. The post-war period wasn't any bed of roses for anybody, including the United Nations either. There was one last copybook operation, the First Iraq War, which was authorized by the Security Council and again led by the United States, which worked exactly as it was supposed to work and got the Iraq to give up Kuwait, which it had captured. Then there were some very large so-called peacekeeping operations, which for once were all in the territories of one state, Cambodia, former Yugoslavia, and so on, which are much more difficult to do than being the umpire between two states with a frontier. Because you meet all sorts of people who don't have sovereignty or authority, warlords, thugs, and so on. And it's a far more difficult thing to do. So the UN got very stretched. I think that both Boutros-Ghali of Egypt, who succeeded Perez de Cuellar, and Kofi Annan, who had 2 terms after Boutros-Ghali, spent a lot of time searching for a new base for the UN to operate from. They had studies of peacekeeping and all sorts of things. It was very difficult to do because the people, I have to say, I don't know whether you noticed, who operated in this building, are extremely conservative. They don't like change. And it's very difficult to reinvent this organization without having change. In fact, you can't do it. The Cold War, curiously enough, was an excuse for not doing anything, for not reinventing the UN. It was so dangerous that there was one objective in everybody's minds, and that was to prevent a nuclear war. And everything else, well, don't worry your head about that, because this is the key thing. And that's really what the UN was geared to. But the moment that threat had just mostly evaporated, people began to look at the UN and saying, yeah, okay, the terrific organization, what does it do? And how does it fit in with the current situation, and so on. And I think that that problem has not yet been solved. In fact, and this is where I think the present Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, has an amazing problem on his hands. It isn't just the terrible things that happen, Haiti or the disaster in Burma, or how on earth to do something about Zimbabwe or something like that. They're bad enough. But what is very difficult is to get people to consider that this organization, founded 65 years ago, by definition is a little bit old-fashioned. Well, we know the Security Council is rather old-fashioned because it represents the geopolitical situation in 1945, but there's something relatively old-fashioned, and I say this with extreme nervousness. There's something relatively old-fashioned about the idea of national sovereignty being the absolutely overarching principle of any organization, particularly when you look around the world and see that globalization, which is the opposite, is taken over almost other fields of human activity. I think that to some extent the UN is still the relic of a past age when national sovereignty was the gold standard of international relations. Because the problems we're now looking at, climate change or nuclear proliferation or pandemics or whatever it is, are simply products of a globalized world, and they are by definition problems which no country, however powerful, can deal with it on its own. This has to be a general international endeavor. And to do that, you have to enhance in some way the respect that everybody has for international organization, and look at how the very important concept of national sovereignty can be, to some extent, remodeled. I mean, I think Copenhagen, among other things, that meeting in Copenhagen, which was a great disappointment to everybody, was very much an example of why this is true. And now I really will stop. I think the question is, can the governments here, 192 of them here in the UN, start reconciling the principle of national sovereignty, a very important principle, with the problem of international responsibility and action on global problems? Because that is the problem now. I mean, are we going to go on being marginal, or is this going to become genuinely an organization of the 21st century? Thank you.